So it definitely feels like we're in the home stretch of this season of Star Trek Discovery, because this episode felt like we're at the beginning of the third act, with a lot of the pieces falling into place and things being solved. Quick reminder that there will be huge spoilers for this week's episode of Star Trek Discovery, but honestly I would say that episode 8 is one of the better episodes of the season, because I think they handled the things really well for the most part, did a lot of stylistically really cool and unique things. Like, I would say that this episode and then episode 4 with the time skipping have been highlights of the season, which I'm really glad this one was great, because I haven't been really hating or disliking this season so far, but I've definitely had a feeling of just not being super invested in the overall plot. And I was feeling a bit weird that the one episode of the season I really liked was the episode that was very standalone and very isolated from the plot of the season. I mean, to me that really said a lot about how I feel about the season if the one episode I like is pretty much not attached to anything else. So at least now I can say there's an episode that is important to the season that I felt was good. Now, before jumping further into the episode, just a reminder to subscribe if you're not already. I make Star Trek videos weekly along with some Marvel and DC videos on the regular, so if that kind of content interests you, make sure to stick around. Now, at the beginning of the season, I talked a little about how I was expecting this season to feel sort of like a video game in terms of its setup and in terms of its pacing, because the writers and the cast had talked about the season's arc being like this fun adventure and this quest searching for something and trying to get there before the other group does, and I felt like that a little bit early on with jumping around from planet to planet. But as the Breen became more important in this season, it felt like that feeling sort of went away. Now personally, I definitely felt like the video game feeling returned heavily in this episode, because the overall story here felt like a mission in Uncharted towards the end of the game. You have like Nathan and Sully, they're both getting close to the final clue and the final piece of the mystery, but the villains and enemies of the game are right behind them, and just always about to get there, and then we get them finding the clue just as the villains put them in a tight spot where they need to give up the clue to get out of it. That felt very, very video game in terms of its plot. And this is a good thing to me, because I think that this season feels very distinct and feels very unique from every other Discovery season, with the one that's most comparable being Season 2, I guess, since Season 2 was so focused on jumping after the red lights, piecing together where they were coming from, and the mystery of who the Red Angel was. Now, I think maybe the overall idea of the Season 2 mystery was more interesting to me than the Progenitors mystery this season, but I will say that I think Season 5 is actually handling their mystery in a much better way than Season 2 did, because Season 2 to me felt sloppy in some areas that Season 5 is sort of escaping. But the main gist of this episode involved a lot of Breen politics over on their giant dreadnought ship. While Discovery gets through the Badlands, finds the archive, Michael has to go through a labyrinth mindscape inside her mind to find the clue, and the show had a real intensity and quick-paced feel to it this week. It felt like every scene was kind of going at warp speed, which I mentioned last week that I felt they took a serious approach last episode that felt like a really tight, well-written show sometimes, and then this week I felt like that tight, well-written feel expanded to most corners of the episode instead of just being focused on very specific areas of the show like last week was. Now, the Mindscape stuff with Michael was the most important and lengthy part of the episode, and it was really surprisingly my favourite part of the episode. And the reason why it surprises me is because I usually sort of can't get too invested in the Inception-y, you die in your mind, you die in real life stories, because I feel like every single show does one of these at some point. It's kind of like Groundhog Day, or I guess Cause and Effect from Next Generation style episodes, where every show feels like they gotta do one of these at some point. It's like a checklist for sci-fi TV writers, and I respect that, but it does mean that sometimes you can kind of know what to expect. But I think Discovery did one of the more impressive ones here than I've seen in recent memory. Now, interestingly, in the final stretch of Deep Space Nine, they did a similar sort of premise. In Season 7, Episode 23, Extreme Measures, Julian and Miles go inside Sloane's mind from Section 31 because he's dying, and only he has the cure for Odo and the shapeshifters. So they go inside Sloane's mind, and there are data pads everywhere that you know have information on them for important things, and it's just a great episode. But the way that the Mindscape in this episode was, this giant library with so many books and informations on things, sort of kind of gave me similar vibes to Deep Space Nine, where we have Michael looking through all of this information, trying to find the clue. They even give a mention of books on the Dominion War, and we had Michael briefly looking through those books, and I was kind of at first expecting something major to come out of that, but it was just a shout out and call back to earlier on in the season. Now, the main thing in this Mindscape involved the interactions between Sonequa Martin Green as Michael Burnham and David Ajala playing a very different role than usual, where he plays this sort of manifestation of a mind program style thing created by Dr. Darks. Dr. Darks being the Betazoid scientist that was one of the members of the group hiding the clue. Now, this gave David a chance to give some really cool performances that we're not used to seeing from him on the show, because Buck is obviously a very different character. But I was honestly really surprised with the fact that some of my favourite scenes in this episode were between his character and Michael. And this completely comes down to Sonequa's acting here, because there are two scenes in particular where she kind of just brings her absolute A game, and I think both scenes could be in the conversation for my favourite involving her in the entire show. Now, the first scene involved her getting passionate and serious about what she thinks of herself and what she thinks of her role in Starfleet, and that was great, but I thought the scene that came after that was even better, because as the lights are shutting down all around her and she thinks she's on death's door, where she's going to die inside this mindscape, and she just sort of unloads on David's character in a very emotional and fantastically acted way. And one of the major criticisms I see thrown at Discovery quite a lot, even from non-Star Trek fans, I see this thrown at Discovery a lot, is how to some people it feels like Discovery can go far too overboard with the emotional scenes or the dramatic scenes in terms of characters getting emotional. And I'll be completely honest, I think sometimes, yeah, that's a valid complaint. The show isn't nearly as bad on it now, but during season 3, for example, I do think the show had a bit of a problem with how much they'd put those scenes in every episode. This episode with Sonequa as Michael is one of the times I think Discovery absolutely earned that kind of scene and absolutely nailed it, because it felt real. You felt attached to the character and what she was saying, and it was really impressive, and it's great to see some of these scenes from the character before Discovery bows out forever, because I think it was a needed scene. Sticking with the labyrinth and maze scenes for a second, I also felt like the show was doing a really good job with sucking you into the search for the clue during those moments, because when Michael is trying to find her way out and she's realizing the right directions to go in, the music and the camera work was really well done and really sucked you into the scene and into Michael's position. In terms of the actual clue, we finally got the location of the progenitor's tech, and we're going to be exploring that next episode, but the Breen also have that location due to an ultimatum, so we're going to see how all that turns out. The clue had that same logo or insignia on it that I was convinced was Iconian related, that's my bad. But for the Breen stuff, a lot of the episode took place over there with the Primarch and Scion all arguing with Maul about what to do about Locke with the tech and all that sort of stuff. And I think this is one part of the episode that I took a few minor issues with. Mainly because to me, this kind of felt like a random little stop from what the main episode was. Maul was confusing me a little bit, sort of heavily arguing against attacking the Federation, and then when she said like 5 words and immediately all the Breen jumped to her side at the end of the episode, I don't know, I didn't buy a lot of this story this week. Well, I think everything on Discovery and the Archive was really well acted and really well paced. The Breen ship was unfortunately where I felt a little uninvested. You could kind of see where these scenes were going pretty immediately, so it was sort of just wheel spinning and buying time until we got there. Now I will say, the opening shot of the episode coming out of the Breen visor was great, but just in general, Discovery's cinematography and their shot composition at the beginning of every episode this season has been kind of on point. Now, we got to see the Badlands, and I personally thought this was a really interesting and well done modern upgrade for what they look like. Different to how I felt about the Breen earlier on this season, where I felt like the modern upgrade just made it more boring. I think the modern upgrade here for the Badlands works pretty well. Personally, I do think there was a visual uniqueness to the 90s Badlands that just felt very 90s Star Trek, and I guess I don't know for sure if the modern upgrade does a good job at replicating that feel, but I also understand that the reason 90s Trek versions look like that isn't a visual style, it's because their VFX budget was $0 on a dream. But I still thought the Badlands looked awesome here. I love Discovery traveling through it in a way that it was. Discovery in general was getting absolutely beat up in this episode. Every time we cut to them, it felt like they were having their nacelles blown out or panels blowing up on the ship. And I love that. That felt like it was very true to Star Trek fashion of your ship getting blown the hell up. And I think that the visuals involving Discovery in this episode looked great in every way. The final couple shots of the ship as it's heavily damaged really reminded me of like Star Trek Enterprise during the Xindi arc or something like that. I think that was awesome. The Archive itself was also awesome, just this giant library in space, kind of like a Star Trek Library of Alexandria, and that's a really cool concept. Reminds me of Star Trek Enterprise in Season 2, Episode 1, where Archer and Daniels are inside that Earth library in the 31st century, and Archer sees like the Romulan Star Empire book, and Daniels is like, yeah, you should probably read that. It reminded me of that, especially with the kind of the mention of the Dominion War sort of section of the books. But then Hyrel, who works in the Archive, was also a cool character. I've seen some people mention that she might be a visual upgrade of the Xindi Primates, who Degra from Star Trek Enterprise was a major Xindi Primate character. This would make sense, since earlier on this season we saw a heavily upgraded Krenim from Voyager. Well, I mean, I guess it's not confirmed that that's a Krenim. I've been saying it's a Krenim because I feel like it is, but I guess there's no official confirmation that I've seen that it is a Krenim. But some other cool Easter eggs involved Book mentioning some books that Michael was looking into before the Mindscape, including Talaxian hairstyles, which Neelix always had great hairstyles. We had Hyperion folktales, which the Hyperions are mostly from Deep Space Nine. We had Euclidean geometry, which is just a reference to the ancient Greek mathematics technique named after the mathematician Euclid. Then Jet later on mentioned the Hyperions and how they love to party, which is a really cool reference to Star Trek Lower Decks, where the Hyperions are the species introduced over there, and they're all about partying using fantasy elements from Earth history. That's a bunch of really cool references. I'm really happy with the Lower Decks reference, honestly. I feel like that show does not get enough love in modern Trek, so I think it's cool that something directly introduced over there has been mentioned by Star Trek Discovery. Raynar was also barely in this episode, but when he was, it was just to be an absolute badass and say some cool one-liners. Also, the energized scene where the Breen shot at the crew before they beamed out was awesome and really reminded me of like Deep Space Nine's By Inferno's Lights episode, where we had a Breen who shot at a Jem'Hadar at the same time as the Jem'Hadar, and they both got vaporized. But also because during that same episode as our characters, they're like beaming out back to their runabout, and then they get shot at, but it just goes through them. Star Trek can be kind of inconsistent about this, I guess, because Hayes during Enterprise got shot through in the same way, but he died, so I guess it just shows how beaming out gets faster and faster as time goes by, because in this episode, it was practically instant them beaming out, so that was really cool. But yeah, honestly, really impressed by Discovery this week. I think it was a really well-written episode that was technically and visually impressive, and easily one of the best episodes of the season. Only 2 episodes left. I'm really interested in how they're going to go about wrapping all of this up. But Star Trek Discovery, Season 5, Episode 8, did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you even watch it? Let me know. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, maybe consider liking, subscribing, sharing. That would all be a huge help to the channel. Thanks so much for watching and have an amazing day.